So my experience sort of with becoming a freelance artist was I trained in theatre from the age of about 14, and that was through like a free performing arts school. And then after I did that, I went to a drama school. And so having gone from a free sort of scenario into like going into that sort of space where you are paying thousands of pounds for university degrees, and for the first time sort of dealing with a student income. And in my first year of uni, I had no idea about budgeting, had no sort of experience of understanding of how to manage my money. And I got into debt. So I have been living with debt and not like paying money off of it every month because I went into overdraft. And part of that was because of, I think when I left uni, I wasn't being charged for it. And then 3 years after, they had put in this new thing that like once it's turned into from a student account into a normal account, it like you start paying it off. Yeah, so I'm paying off that, you know, and that affects my finances on a monthly basis. And then also, yes, university. So in my degree, I did maybe not so traditional performing arts course, and it was about like devised theatre. And they don't really teach you anything about sort of managing budget or it's literally one session and that's it, and then you just off you go. Even things including taxes, we had one session on taxes. So I left drama school and then I started getting various jobs in poetry, but also working self-employed part-time. So I was working like bar jobs, that sort of thing. And that, in the first couple of years, fine, because I wasn't earning enough to be paying extra tax, basically, for a lot of my freelance stuff. And then I was paying tax already within PAYE. And then I think a couple of years ago, work was doing really well. It was actually, so during the pandemic, maybe it's good to touch on that a little bit. I was furloughed, so through my employment at my bar job, and that just about got me by. But it did put a lot of pressure on me to do more freelance work. So I spent a lot of time like applying for things. I spent a lot of time, you know, I started my own business, and like it was fruitful in places, but in other places, when you're a freelance artist, often you have to work from home. And being in the same environment that you're like, at one point I was doing a show in my bedroom and waking up every morning looking at the show, and I would not stop working on that show. So it was you end up not having a great work-life balance. And so that means, so I also signed on for universal credit during the pandemic, and that offered me a little bit more for my income, and it was okay, but it was difficult coming out of the pandemic when I was getting more work. And so my earnings started going up, and then I wasn't getting anything from universal credit. But even then, like, I had to put away some, like 20% for my taxes. So, you know, you'd earn £100 for a workshop that you've done or something, and then you're putting 25 quid away of that, or like 20 quid of it away. And that, like, you know, when you're only doing, say, as a freelance artist, you'd be doing one gig, right? and you spend a lot of time preparing, a lot of time planning for that sort of experience, if it's a commission or anything. So a lot of that time for a lot of freelance artists, I think, ends up being unpaid or underpaid. And as a freelance artist, like, it means, you have to sign up to Universal Credit because you don't have consistent income. And, it would get to points where I would, thankfully I have the provision, but like, I can ask my parents sometimes, but even then I can't always, like, sometimes, and I'd avoid it as much as possible, because I think partially when you're working class, like, you're like really just trying to not do that as much as possible, because you know that your parents are struggling as well. So that, and then, like, coming up till now, so I'm at the stage with my taxes where I owe, particularly this year, I'm struggling to pay back the tax that I needed to pay for the last year, because I didn't save enough of my previous taxes for that year. And it ends up just feeling like it's like it's like sand. It's just going back through and just sort of like, I think the effect of that is that it is really hard to even, on forms when they're asking how much your earnings are, it's really hard to know how much you earn. Like, I can estimate how much I would earn, but the job I have is the actual, like, freelance, PAYE job I have is casual contract, 0 hours. So even that is temperamental. But in offering of another system, I think there does need to be some more support for people who do not have consistent incomes. And that could be that, I think, because universal credit works to an extent, but because it is universal, it's covering so many different needs. I think it's not really estimated properly, because at the stage when they stopped paying, I was like off universal credit, I was not in a good financial position. I was like still like barely getting rent, scrimping, going into my other overdraft, or like most of my life involves like hiding money from myself in pots on like my Mundo account in order to manage that. It ends up falling on you a lot more to like budget yourself. And it means that, it does affect your mental health. It means that like sometimes it might mean that I'm like not able to do things socially with people. It means that I'm not, I'm owing money for rent, or owing my friends money if they're like offering to take me out. And then you sort of get into a cycle of debt, essentially. So when you're a freelance artist, particularly, maybe before the pandemic it applied more, but you're expected to kind of just rock up to grab a coffee and meet up with people and chat about projects, go to applications or like job meetings and interviews, networking events, go to see theatre shows or poetry shows, and all of that costs money. And yes, it can be expensed for your freelance work, but you're not going to see that money until a year or 2 years after. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, well, so there's a lot of that stuff that's really difficult, and then means that you're applying for things like Arts Council funding, and that Arts Council application process is like a very long, grueling process, and people who are successful tend to be like, it tends to be people who have a company and structure of people who are doing that application for their job. And as a solo freelance artist, I've seen so many people burn out, particularly working class, particularly people from like global majority. Like, it's it means that they're burning out because they're doing this funding application and they're talking to people and they're trying to run their business and fundamentally burnout is like exhaustion, like low mental health. That's the sort of impact it has. But your question, was more about like what impact has that had on me? Like this, sort of like having to navigate my work as a freelance artist without much income. It does mean it's very difficult. And with these things, I feel like it's hard for me to think through how we sort of help those issues, because with being a freelance artist, there are a lot of intangible ways that people are getting those jobs. So like my career into poetry was I was going to open mic nights. So that's me paying a ticket to go and say my own poem. And going to see shows and meeting people that maybe I want to learn more about their work and try and get more involved with their sort of work. That means a whole load of people who wouldn't normally see themselves as artists wouldn't be able to do it, because they're like, it takes a lot of energy to be able to go up to people and very confidently promote yourself. And even those skills, for someone who's like upper class, very wealthy white person, it's going to be very easy for them. Whereas like working class communities, global majority, like they don't learn those skills to self-promote and be able to try and get those jobs. It means when you get landed with some work that pays money, it means you're not able to look after yourself, essentially. Like I've had budgets where I've like thought so much about like pay, like or even just like breaking it down. It means you have to go to people in other places to like ask about those things. It's not sort of handed to you. Like there are things online that can support that, and there are organisations that have definitely helped me. But that's only because I knew about them, and knowing about them involves being in education spaces where you learn about that. And like thankfully I was able to go to a free performing arts school, but so many artists that come from rural areas of the UK, they're landed with a pot of money, and then the organisation just sort of lets them run off with the money. And then when they're told to do like an evaluation and feedback, they've not factored that into their budget whatsoever. And so they're doing it on free money, like they're doing it on nothing. So there's a lot of precarity within the industry, I think, perpetuated by a lack of funding first and foremost, and a lack of integrated support in bigger organisations, and that so it's like that's coming from government pressure, and it's coming from lack of Arts Council funding or cuts that are happening even within the education sector, the lack of arts in the education sector. And that's also because a lot of my work is about going into schools and teaching writing workshops. And this year particularly, I've had less schools workshops because of funding cuts to arts and English particularly. So that makes a whole generation coming up, it makes it really difficult for them to feel like they can become a writer, an artist, I've had less work, particularly facilitating this year, than I have maybe in the last couple of years. It means it's put a lot more pressure on me to apply for things, where normally I might have offerings available. It means that I end up spending more time in my bar job and not feeling fulfilled, not feeling entirely happy. And even just in the longer term, it means like it affects your relationships with people as well. Like sometimes I feel like I'm not very close to some sectors that I work in, or I don't have that community because I can't afford to go to a poetry night every month. And that's, it makes my working and my interest and my want to write more really difficult, because I end up having to look for more things that will give me money, because I'm just trying to survive rather than like actually thrive, you know? Yeah, even to the point where like I've moved back home with my mum. I lived with my friends for about 4 years, and that sort of transition, and after paying rent, having to go back home is difficult, because, you know, I want to be like ideally living on my own or living with my friends, and not necessarily putting that pressure on my family for support. And actually coming home, like living together with my mum, both of us on lower incomes, it means that when things come up, like, you know, you need to pay a certain bill for, like, say for example, if you have you have to get rid of like an infestation or something, like more recently we've had like mice coming into our house, and it's like, that's a very normal thing, and that cost it's just a lot. It's a lot when, you know, I have to, even to get to work, I have to pay £10 a day, and if I'm doing 3 days a week, that's like £30, maybe more. And also, like, I'm traveling. I usually work before work. My diary, when most people see it, you end up being like chock-a-block, because you need to earn enough. When salaried, I think self-employment more widely does need to be supported more by the government in terms of, funding them, supporting them when they're starting out, and supporting them with knowledge as well, not just money. I think managing budgets, I think inviting or supporting people to access those spaces where they might get jobs, where they might meet people and be able to collaborate. Yeah. When I'm sick, I don't go to my freelance job. There's no pay for me. I don't get that money. There's no sick pay in most of my freelance jobs. Whereas with my part-time bar job, although it's casual, I do get, there's like a certain pot for holiday, and there's a bit more support for you than it for a freelance person. Yeah, I don't get sick pay. And so when I am sick, often I'm working, which isn't good, and isn't good, particularly when you're working with young people as well. Like, I don't want to go in and infect them. So, it makes me exhausted, honestly. I think a lot of freelance artists, it really is about burnout, and I definitely feel burnout regularly. It's a regular part of my career. More widely from financial support, I think like therapy and well-being being subsidised. Something that has actually helped me is having counselling through an organisation that supports low-cost sort of counselling. And even something like having spaces where that information is widely available, because I think it's really difficult to actually research that stuff as well. And even I'm just like thinking of like even understanding your rights as a worker and working in a freelance contract, reading your contract. Legally, I've got no idea sometimes, and I've got into sticky situations where I haven't received a contract or something like that. Although it's a legal obligation, it's usually only the big organisations that do that, and that makes, when you're working with smaller organisations, there's less support because you're just a raw artist going and doing something that's not very clearly outlined. And it's about supporting those arts institutions, or the smaller ones, and not just the bigger ones. And even, do you know what, even as a freelance artist, being paid on time is such a huge problem with particularly big arts institutions, actually. There's a lot of big arts institutions that it's taken 2-3 months for me to get paid, and that's totally illegal technically, but because they have a process of how you need to put in have a PO number generated, and then their finance officer only works 2 days a week. So they're only going to look at yours after they've looked at XYZ people's that's already backed up. Supporting institutions to improve their finance systems so that issues don't happen. They're easier, I think. That's it. That they're easier to access. To get your PA number sent and for you to be able to invoice straight away. I actually more recently have been applying for salaried jobs in arts spaces because of the pressure that just working freelance and doing casual work has done. I'm moving out of that, and I know that there's lots of other people like me who are trying to move out of that, and I don't want to do that. That's not something I want to do. And that's partly because I'm made to feel like my role as an artist is not important in society. And that affects the way I make work, and that affects the way I look after myself or don't look after myself. And so, it means I'm living to work, which, for some people, they want to do that, but that's not something I want to do. I want to be able to relax. It makes relaxing really hard. And I think the society around it is built around making me feel like I'm like a bohemian running around making artwork that's really conscious and puts you in this sort of oh, you're this snowflake that's just going around and making stuff. And all of these structural issues, I think, feed into that mentality that makes me feel like I need to get a more salaried job because I have so many pressures left, right, centre, financially, emotionally, physically. Even commuting, it takes anything, but all of those pressures exist, so for example, years and years ago, I did the Edinburgh Fringe Festival, and the sort of that Fringe Festival, it does end up being saturated with a lot of white upper class theatre companies or artists that can afford to go to Edinburgh because they can afford to go and stay in accommodation for 2-3 grand sometimes. Or, they know the right people that might be able to get a discount. And so it means that when working class people go up to Edinburgh and, you're supposed to enjoy the sort of festival atmosphere and network and go to all of these shows, you spend so much money and then come back and are exhausted because you've just done a month's worth of shows, and then you have to spend money going out and seeing shows and you come back and it's the summer, so it's August. You come back and it's September and there's no work going because everyone's just recovering from the fringe, and you're just sort of faffing around, like, and you've got, you know, no money.